All right. Well, hello and welcome to the ASL Lecture Series. I am Barbara Ray Holcomb, and together with my colleagues, we have coordinated Dr. Lane's visit here. My colleague, Dr. Christine Monikowski, and my colleague, Dr. Karen Christie, and I have worked together to bring this historic and exciting event to NTID. Dr. Harlan Lane, and this is his name sign. We are thrilled and honored to have him here at NTID. We have 3 interpreters today, and they are Gail Macias, Carolyn Kropp, and Kathy Gillies. And Carolyn and Gail will be signing for Dr. Lane during his presentation. Dr. Lane actually came here one more time back in 1990, which was about 22 years ago, believe it or not, and I had to go look up what the title of his speech was. He spoke to us about advocacy, oppression, and social change. Do any of you remember coming to his presentation? I see several of you in the audience were here for that presentation. I'd like to give you a little background about Dr. Lane. He is from Northeastern University, and he has garnered many honors for his work in the field. Some of those honors that have been bestowed on him are from the National Association of the Deaf, the World Federation of the Deaf, which is signed like this, and the Powery V. Doctor, Chair of Deaf Studies at Gallaudet University. And the last honor I want to mention is the American Speech, Language, and Hearing Association Journal Editor Award for Hearing and Speech. Also, Dr. Lane has written many books. I'll just name 3. You probably all know about these important works: When the Mind Hears, The Mask of Benevolence, and A Journey into the Deaf World. And today, we are thrilled that he is going to come and talk with us about his new book, The People of the Eye. And I know that you are all looking forward to learning what he has to share about his book today. Welcome, Dr. Lane.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. My talk today concerns ethnicity, ancestry, and the deaf world. It's based on a book we've just published, which you see there on the screen, The People of the Eye, Deaf Ethnicity and Ancestry. The publisher is Oxford University Press, and I'll be signing books after the talk. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Richard Pillard, who's an expert in family studies, and Ulf Hedberg, who's a deaf expert in genealogy and archives. So I'm concerned this evening, or I guess it's afternoon, this late afternoon, with the linguistic and cultural minority in America called the deaf world. That's to say, deaf ASL speakers. I will briefly review the evidence that this minority is best understood as an ethnic group. Now, in focusing on deaf ASL speakers for a study of ethnicity, I don't mean to minimize the importance of other people in the deaf community. It's just that if any class of deaf people constitutes an ethnic group, surely it is the class with their own language and culture, the sign language minority. In choosing to address this minority, we also benefit by considerable research on its language, history, social structure, and so forth. Now, some scholars have argued that ethnicity is a poor fit to what we know about ASL speakers. In this talk, I consider some of their main objections, and I find them flawed. But first, is the deaf world really best understood as an ethnic group? Figure 2 shows the criteria that have been advanced by social scientists for classifying a social group as an ethnic group. Let's consider each of the ethnic features and see how the deaf world measures up. Collective name. Well, check, the deaf world has one. Feeling of community. This is really important. The members of ethnic groups characteristically feel a strong sense of belonging to the group. And Americans in the deaf world do indeed feel a strong identification with that world and show great loyalty to it. Norms of behavior. Check. In deaf culture, as in many ethnic groups, there are norms for relating to the deaf world, for decision making, norms for managing information, for constructing discourse, for gaining status, for managing debt, and many more such norms. Ethnic groups have distinct values. Check. Like ethnic groups, deaf world members actively value their deaf identity, their sign language, cultural loyalty, the residential schools, and more. Knowledge. Check. Deaf people have culture-specific knowledge, such as who their leaders are and their characteristics, what's up with the rank and file members of the deaf world, important events in deaf history, how to manage in difficult situations with hearing people. They know the deaf world values, customs, and social structure. Well, let's speak about customs. Ethnic groups have characteristic customs. The deaf world has its own ways of doing things, of doing introductions and departures, of taking turns in a conversation, of speaking frankly and of speaking politely. It has its own taboos. Social structure. Check. There are numerous organizations in the American deaf world: athletic, social, political, literary organizations, religious ones, leisure groups, and many more. Now we come to one of the most important criteria: language. Ethnic groups are often a linguistic minority. The deaf world speaks ASL. It's well known as a language minority. Competence in ASL is a hallmark of deaf ethnicity in the United States and some other parts of North America. The sign language of the deaf world is the core of deaf world authenticity. The arts. Check. Like many ethnic groups, the deaf world is rich in artistic expression. First come the language arts, and they are many and rich. ASL narratives, storytelling, oratory, humor, tall tales, wordplay, pantomime, poetry, the list goes on and on. And in addition to these language arts, there are theater arts, and of course the visual arts addressed to deaf culture and experience. History. Check again. The deaf world has a rich past recounted in storytelling, books, films, videos, and DVDs. As with ethnic groups, a sense of common history unites successive generations. Ethnic history focally concerns oppression, and interestingly, it has a characteristic rhetorical structure. I will tell you that common rhetorical structure of ethnic group history, and you can judge the fit of deaf world history. Here it is. In the beginning, we were dispersed and isolated. But then our people gathered and built our institutions. Then came a golden age in which we flourished, followed by the dark ages of oppression. But we rose up again, victorious, and we recovered our lost values and prestige. Does the deaf world history fit that format? Very much so. Finally, boundaries. Many scholars in the field of ethnicity believe that these internal properties that I've just examined with you must also be accompanied by an external property, a boundary, separating the ethnic group from other groups, in particular separating the ethnic group from the majority. So the question is, does the deaf world in the United States occupy its own niche? Does it look to itself in large part for the satisfaction of certain needs, while looking to the larger society for the satisfaction of other needs? Here I've made a list of activities that are primarily conducted by deaf people for deaf people. I'll give you a moment to look at it. Deaf people serve deaf people in areas such as athletics, leisure, ASL teaching and research, and so forth. It's a long list. It seems clear that the deaf world occupies a distinctive niche in the larger society. So all in all, we conclude, even with this brief survey, that the American deaf world today meets the criteria for ethnic groups. However, a number of objections have been raised. I want to address 5 of them with you this afternoon. The first objection concerns kinship, the rules by which people are related to one another. The challenge. Members of many ethnic groups are kin to one another. Members of the deaf world are, however, not kin. So the deaf world is not an ethnic group. Our reply: we disagree. Scholars give different definitions of kinship in ethnic groups, but all of the definitions fit the deaf world. Let's look at them. Some scholars maintain that the core of ethnicity lies in those cultural properties we just surveyed, so an ethnic group doesn't need to have kin. But other scholars say kinship should be taken in its social meaning as those to whom we owe primary solidarity, sort of like a family. In a family, even unrelated aunts and uncles are considered kin because there's some kind of primary solidarity that we owe them, along with, of course, our parents, our cousins and nephews, and so on. So is there a strong sense of solidarity in the deaf world? Indeed there is. The metaphor, it seems to me, the metaphor of family goes far in describing many deaf world norms and practices. So by this criterion, solidarity, ASL signers are kin. Some scholars say what kinship is really about is continuity. It's a link to the past. Continuity from one generation to the next. Well, the deaf world does pass down its norms, knowledge, language, and values from one generation to the next. Deaf adults and deaf peers socialize deaf children, assuring cultural transmission. So in that sense of kinship, continuity, members of the deaf world are indeed kin. When we think of ethnic kinship, yet other scholars argue, what's really at stake is biological resemblance among the members. But in that case, members of the deaf world are kin, since they have a profound resemblance to one another biologically, in that they are visual people. Maybe I'll expand on that for just a moment. A couple nights ago, I was talking about this book with the head of the Massachusetts State Association of the Deaf, and after I explained why I thought that ASL speakers were an ethnic group, I asked him if he bought the argument. And he said, no, I don't, because black Americans are black, for example, and Asian Americans look Asian. But in the deaf world, we have some of every kind. We have some blacks, some Asians, people with roots in Asia, and so on. I wasn't fast enough to give the counter-argument, but when I got home, I realized that, yes, the deaf world resembles one another, not by skin color, but by another feature of the human body, namely that they are visual people, that they rely on vision for processing information, for moving about. So I've since sent him an email to clear that up. So that's for resemblance. Deaf ASL speakers do indeed resemble one another. There's probably more to that resemblance, too, than just the fact that they're visual, because there is this saying among many deaf people when looking at a baby that the baby has deaf eyes. Have you heard that expression? And I speculate that what they're referring to is a child's way of scanning the environment, which is probably different among deaf children than among hearing children. But now we come to the real meat of it. Many scholars insist that kinship in ethnic groups requires blood ties, that is, hereditary links among its members. Sometimes that's called shared ancestry. If you and I are related hereditarily, it means that we have one or more shared ancestors. Now, we estimate that approximately 3/4 of deaf ASL signers are deaf due to heredity. 3/4. It's often said that very few deaf children are born into the deaf world, since as few as 4% have deaf parents. But that's wrong. Most deaf ASL signers have inherited their membership in the deaf world. Rather few are deaf due to disease or trauma. So most ASL speakers are hereditarily deaf. But do they share ancestors? We have traced many deaf Americans in early times to their shared ancestors due to deaf-deaf marriages. We've been investigating the founding deaf families in New England, in particular those in southern New Hampshire, also on the island of Martha's Vineyard, and in Maine. Our book contains over 200 pedigrees, that's to say family trees of deaf people, that extend in some cases over 300 years. We trace many deaf people back to their ancestors who first came to America. They are called progenitors. This research revealed that nearly 40 progenitors on Martha's Vineyard and in Maine had ancestors in the county of Kent in England. Now, when two deaf people have a shared ancestor, it means they are related to one another. Shared ancestry is very common in the deaf world pedigrees we have examined. This is partly because deaf people so often married other deaf people. Here's an example. In these pedigrees, the dark symbols represent deaf people, and the squares are males, and the circles are females. Now, can you find, I left my laser pointer down off stage, but can you find the George and Nancy marriage there? George is a Curtis and Nancy is a Rowe. They were hereditarily deaf for different reasons, so they were not related, but all their descendants were related, of course. Nancy's ancestors came from Devon in England. When they immigrated to America, they settled first in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and then land in the Maine wilderness was offered for free to settlers, and so they moved to Maine. As you can see there, Nancy Rowe had 5 deaf brothers, 2 deaf sisters, and 5 hearing siblings. Those are the white boxes. Nancy's parents were related. They were hearing and distantly related. Nancy entered the American Asylum for the Education and Instruction of the Deaf and Dumb in 1829 when she was 13 years old. And 5 of her brothers and sisters went to that school. When Nancy was 24, she married George Curtis. So let's look at his family tree. Before we do, notice that the Rowes are not only linked to the Curtises by marriage, by several marriages, but they're also linked to the Reeds by marriage. Oops. Oh, I'm missing a slide here. Okay, well, that's okay. These deaf-deaf marriages that you see link all these different groups, like the Reeds, the Curtises and Rowes, and so on. What we did was to track this out fully and find all the marriages related to the Curtis-Rowe marriage. So the block between Curtis and Rowe is at your upper right, in the second row, 1 column in. This is the kinship network that resulted from marriages between the Curtis and the Rowes. The solid lines show families linked to one another by deaf-deaf marriages. For example, George Curtis married Nancy Rowe. That's why there's a line between Curtis and Rowe up there. And in so doing, linked the Curtis and Rowe families. The Campbell family, which is up there, was linked to Curtis Rowe because deaf Abner Campbell married deaf Olive Curtis. And when she died, he married deaf Ann Curtis. The Reed families up there, it joined the Curtis-Rowe-Campbell cluster as a result of deaf Benjamin Rowe's marriage to deaf Lucy Reed. Deaf George Campbell brought the Gibson family into the network with his marriage to deaf Sarah Gibson, which in turn linked up with the Wakefield family, and so forth. These deaf-deaf marriages were important links among deaf families, for the children of those marriages would have the combined heritage of both their parents' extended families, including their genetic heritage. All in all, this figure presents 52 families with deaf members that were linked to one another. Deaf families were also linked by mixed marriages, by which I mean one spouse hearing, one deaf, but I didn't put them in the diagram because it would get even more difficult to read. Did I say that these linkages shape the everyday lives of family members? They traveled together, they socialized their children together, they tended to the ill, they sought work for the unemployed, and so on. So you can see that ASL speakers, like many ethnic groups, frequently have shared ancestors. All the children of all these families have shared ancestors. But there's a deeper reason for shared ancestry among the members of the deaf world. Any two deaf people who are hereditarily deaf for the same reason must be related, because where could they get the deaf gene from? They must have gotten it from a common ancestor. There is one proviso, which is that the same mutation which led to deafness could have occurred in two people independently. So if I pick two deaf people today, they might not really be related. But that's improbable. The overwhelming likelihood is that two deaf people who are hereditarily deaf today have shared ancestors. So look at your brother and your sister on your left and right and smile. Well, what about ASL speakers who are not hereditarily deaf? They are often members of the deaf world. And I answer, they are, as it were, adopted into the deaf world on the basis of shared physical features and language. In fact, that's not unusual. Ethnography teaches us that entire tribes may acquire kinship to members of other tribes even though they have no blood relation, because they use the same language and they look similar. So no matter the definition of kinship, solidarity, continuity, resemblance, or shared ancestry, all kinship definitions fit the deaf world. So the criticism was an error. Challenge number 2 concerns socialization. The challenge. Children in ethnic groups are socialized by a blood relative, their parents, but most children in the deaf world are not. So the deaf world is not an ethnic group. We disagree. In many ethnic groups, children are not socialized by their blood relatives. Instead, in those ethnic groups, the people who count as your parents are those who raised you, who socialized you, blood relation or not. I'll name 2 cultures among many where the people who count as your parents are those who socialized you, not necessarily those who gave birth to you. In Langkawi, which is an archipelago in Malaysia, mothers often feed their biological children along with unrelated adopted children. So powerful is the adoptive mother's role in socialization that she becomes the true mother of them all. All her children, biological and adoptive, are seen as brothers and sisters. None of them is allowed to marry another, because that would be incest. The unrelated children are even said, I find this charming, are said to resemble the mother. So for those children, as for the deaf children of hearing parents, ethnic socialization is carried out by someone who is unrelated to them. My second example of non-blood relatives, people unrelated to the child, socializing the child, comes from southern China, the Yao peoples. They raise many non-Yao children with their real children, their biological children. And those adopted children are seen as related to the people who raised them in all respects. The adopted children even participate as Yao in the many rituals of the ethnic group, such as ancestor worship. Well, that's two examples. There are many more. So the deaf world is one among many ethnic groups where children are socialized by adults and peers who are not related to them. So the deaf world does not disqualify as an ethnic group on the grounds that it's people other than the deaf child's parents that socialize him or her to the deaf world. The third challenge concerns assimilation. The challenge. Ethnic groups in the United States assimilate after a few generations, but members of the deaf world often continue to marry deaf members and to communicate in their minority language without assimilating. So the deaf world is not an ethnic group because it doesn't assimilate. We disagree. Granted, the descendants of many American immigrants have assimilated, but many have not. Resistance to assimilation is not unique to the deaf world. All of the following minorities resist assimilation: the Amish, the Roma, let's say Gypsies, Mennonites, Chinese residents of older Chinatowns, Native American tribal groups, the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia, and so on. All of these groups, by and large, fail to assimilate. Other ethnic groups, such as those in the Swat Valley of northern Pakistan, live together, dependent on one another, with neither party assimilating toward the other party. So the deaf world is among the numerous ethnic groups whose culture and circumstances lead them to maintain their ethnic heritage down through the generations. Challenge 4 concerns deaf bodies. The challenge. All the members of the deaf world have a disability. No other ethnic group is like that. Our reply. Many ethnicities have distinguishing physical traits. Norwegians tend to be tall. Japanese tend to be relatively short. Members of the deaf world also have a distinguishing physical trait. They rely on vision primarily. But is that a disability? Let's go a little afield for a moment and consider the Pygmies of Central Africa, whose ethnicity also incorporates a distinctive trait, namely short height. They average only 4.5 feet. Now, the Pygmies' physical makeup and their circumstances are perfectly married. It would be a mistake to class Pygmies as disabled and to give them growth hormone. Because of the Pygmies' height, they get by with fewer calories. They can build small temporary huts quickly, and they can move rapidly through the jungle underbrush in search of game. Pygmies hunt wild game together using nets. Their customs and their values are communal, which reflects the collaborative hunt. And that, in turn, reflects the Pygmies' physical makeup and environment. Do pygmies have a disability in their small size? Of course not. They have an advantage. Now, there are Bantu villagers farming at the edge of the pygmy forest. They have contempt for the pygmies because they say the pygmies are puny, little runts. And the pygmies have contempt for the Bantu villagers, who they call clumsy elephants, because they're much too tall to move swiftly in the forest and would die of starvation. Each ethnic group considers the other to have a disability in the physical size of its members. And each group fails to appreciate how physical makeup, culture, and environment go together. Now note that physical difference is a part of ethnicity, and not just incidental. The physical facts underpin pygmy ethnicity, just as they underpin deaf ethnicity. Because physical makeup and ethnicity often go together, we can recognize a newborn pygmy as a pygmy and a newborn deaf child as ethnically deaf. A deaf child is ethnically deaf from the moment it is a visual child, and thus has the potential to thrive in an ASL environment. So we agree that members of the deaf world, like members of other ethnic groups, share physical traits, but we dispute that the ASL speakers in the deaf world have a disability. It's simply a matter of human variation, like the pygmy and the Bantu. The last challenge concerns the politics of ethnicity. The challenge: it is unwise for ASL speakers to affirm they are an ethnic group, to insist on separatism. It's a hearing world, after all, and moreover, ethnic groups are often a source of strife. Our reply: it's true that ethnicity can be divisive, especially when manipulated by political and religious forces. But ethnicity is a basic human good and a natural right. Ethnicity offers the rewards of language and culture and provides for their transmission across the generations. Ethnicity leads us to work together for shared goals. Ethnicity facilitates intimate attachment to others. Ethnicity gives us a distinctive identity, even as modern society dilutes our identities. Moreover, research shows that preserving a tie to your own group and culture fosters self-esteem. It fosters life satisfaction, and it contributes to a general sense of well-being. Besides, our nation must encourage our ethnic groups if we are to talk with the rest of the world. According to many deaf scholars, the deaf world is seeking integration with a measure of autonomy. And that's just what other ethnic groups are seeking. They want both participation in mainstream society and also the preservation of their ethnic identity. The route to successful participation in society can never be the denial of one's own identity. Deaf scholar Ben Behan speaks of a safe harbor where deaf people can anchor their connections to one another after traveling on the high seas with the rest of humanity. Deaf historian Joseph Murray explains that the deaf have traditionally expected both to participate in a society not tailored to deaf norms and also to have a separate space of being deaf. He calls the joint expectation co-equality. Deaf scholar Tom Humphreys has expressed it as follows, I quote, "Deaf people have a vision of integration that is different from what hearing people envision for them. Deaf people see grounding in the culture and sign language of the deaf community in which they live as the most important factor in their lives. Integration comes more easily and more effectively from these roots." End quote. Now you may wonder, what does it matter whether the deaf world is an ethnic group or not? And I reply that classifying social issues appropriately is very important. Representation is an ideological force. Think about the case of ASL. When the manual communication of deaf people in America came to be classified as a natural language, many positive developments followed. Likewise, when we recognize that the deaf world is one of our nation's ethnic groups, we can expect positive developments to follow. The right of individuals to speak the language of their choosing is protected as part of civil rights, in particular freedom of expression, which includes the use of their ethnic language at home and in school. The denial of this right to use the ethnic language can be challenged under anti-discrimination laws, which are there to protect ethnic minorities. So understood as an ethnic group, the deaf world would be protected by national and international laws that protect the language and culture of ethnic groups. Furthermore, the reproductive rights of ethnic group members would be protected, as would their right to participate in decision-making that affects them. Our book discusses several other potential advantages of embracing deaf ethnicity, but Tom Humphreys summarizes it all very well. I'll quote him. "Acceptance of deaf ethnicity alters the relationship between deaf and hearing people and creates opportunities for deaf people to bring about change." Thank you.
Well, thank you for a fascinating presentation. I'm just wondering, it seems as though there's many similarities between American deaf culture and other countries' deaf culture, like for Chinese deaf culture. So I'm wondering if you looked at how we have some relation between American deaf culture and ethnicity and other deaf cultures in other countries.
That's a really wonderful question. I wish I knew something to say to you. I don't think it's entirely my fault. I don't know of good cross-cultural studies of deaf communities, and it really should be a high priority. I would mention that our colleague Paddy Ladd, you know Paddy perhaps, a British deaf leader and thinker, he's been promoting this concept of deafhood, D-E-A-F-H-O-O-D. And what he has in mind is just what you're talking about, that is, that there's something in common between the community of deaf people in China using Cantonese Sign Language or whatever the language, and the ASL speakers in America. So programmatically, I think he's on the same, we're all on the same wavelength, but as far as having content to report, I don't know. You know, there is some work on international sign and by Ted Sapala and others. So you can get some glimpse about language relations. There's some cross-cultural research on languages, certainly. But on the culture, I'm not aware of it myself. Sorry.
Oh, that's fine. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Frances Kimmis. I am profoundly deaf and was born deaf. Your presentation this afternoon was astounding. You didn't talk about hearing people at all, and you really honored the deaf world. I don't understand that. You're one person who really gets the deaf world and deaf ethnicity. I'm wondering, how is that possible?
Very, very nice. Thank you.
I am a lover of history, and I know that Moses was a Jew. He was born and sent down the river, and he was adopted by the Egyptians, and then he came back to the Jews and talked about the history. And he talked about all that would happen within that culture. And he understood how it feels to be an alien in a foreign land. And I feel that you do as well. You've really captured our culture so well.
I just want to say thank you for honoring me in that way. That's very gracious of you. Appreciate it.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Lane. I wanted to start by saying I just absolutely loved, as an anthropologist, I absolutely loved what you had to say about kinship and the similarity of deaf culture to some of the other models for kinship that we have. I think that was really dead on. As the hearing parent of a deaf person, I wondered about the culture being passed down because, of course, it seems like that usually the culture is passed laterally, and that's what I guess we used to say in the old days amongst deaf kids, that they aren't so much adopted by deaf parents as they are by their friends and their peers. And so I wonder about other models, for instance, the kinship of choice that you see in the gay community and things of that nature. So I'm just wondering about other models because it seems that it's only partially so for deaf parents, ASL-speaking deaf parents to, in some sense, adopt deaf children.
I'm sorry, I may not have been quite clear enough. What I'm saying is that, at least it has been true for a very long time, that deaf children were socialized by deaf peers and deaf adults.
Yeah.
So therefore, if they have hearing parents, the hearing parents are not doing the socializing. Instead, these other people are. And what I was arguing in the paper was that that's not uncommon. There are many ethnic groups where the socializing is carried out by somebody other than the parents. Such as the Yao and the Langkawi examples. So that mimics the situation. I mean, those are similar situations in that the parents don't get to do the socializing, an unrelated person does. In the case of the deaf world, a dorm counselor, a friend, an older deaf person. In the case of the Yao, what happens in the case of the Yao is that they adopt all these children, and when the children are old enough, they work on the fields to earn their living. So that this way they have a crew of people available to do the work. So I think there's similar situations in those two. What might seem a little more disputable is this: if you pick a hereditarily deaf person and say they are hereditarily deaf, and they say, well, but I don't know any deaf person in my family, I've never heard of such a thing. You might say, well, there could be many that you don't know about, for one thing. But more likely, the hearing ancestors are carrying the deaf gene. So from my point of view, the deafness in its physical expression is carried in reality or in potentiality from every single generation. There are no skipped generations in the transmission of the crucial trait, but there are skipped generations in the expression of that trait. So that's a little hair-splitting that might not please everybody, but I think we need to recognize that hearing parents of a deaf child typically are the ancestors, are vehicles for the ancestry of that child back to some deaf ancestors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does that help?
Oh yeah, and I agree with you. I was just searching for some more clarification because I think some of the models that we have for kinship are not always totally accurate anyway.
That's right.
Because there are so many other people that are socializing that child, and I think we kind of get stuck on the kind of the American model where it's just the nuclear family.
Yeah, as you know, there's some scholars who just say, look, this kinship thing's a myth. It's a way of saying, you know, you and I, we're together in this, we share so much, I'm committed to you, you're committed to me. You're really family. If you're family, then we're kin. But that's not meant in a literal sense.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, we have another question.
It is an honor that you're here. It's like better than Christmas. But I just wanted to ask, this is all great, but what happens now? Because most of our deaf kids don't go to deaf schools. They don't have other deaf people to teach them these things. They aren't exposed to their own language of ASL. So what happens? How do they become people of the eye and know that they do have a kinship with others? And how do we teach them, once they come to a place like NTID, how do we teach them that, yes, you do have a language, you do have a culture and a history? Any suggestions?
Well, I think the first thing is to be very clear about it ourselves. I mean, those people in the group, ASL speakers, and to try and urge this understanding, this fresh understanding on the people and institutions that matter, aspects of the government, individuals and schools of education, and otologists and audiologists and all manner of kind. And maybe it could be maybe it will facilitate it to say, you know, we now understand that this group within the larger deaf community is an ethnic group. And with ethnic groups, the goal is not to avoid their having children like themselves. The goal is not to mitigate who they are. It's instead to cherish it, foster it, and so on. I guess you got to start with just making clear your position. And maybe children could have a little golden book of deaf ethnicity that they could relate to. But then beyond that comes the curriculum issue of, in schools and universities, of implementing that understanding, which could very well involve a more anthropological and sociological approach. There's more about this today in the deaf world than there used to be, but there's still not very much. There's much, much more about language and about history, it seems to me. So we need to strengthen those disciplines that are related to ethnicity as a priority. And then there's the traditional issues. How do we reach the parents? And will this help or hinder? And what to do about, I've had deaf people say to me, everything you say is right, but don't go on saying it because we're going to lose our disability rights. And that's an important catch-22 to really think through together. How to, you know, there's a newspaper in Boston called the Deaf Community News. When ADA was passed, the headlines in that newspaper said ADA passed, and underneath it said that for the purposes of the legislation, deaf people were considered disabled. What was interesting was that the newspaper had to explain itself because they knew that the deaf community wouldn't understand why they care about ADA. Since they don't have a disability, why should they be all worked up about that? And so the newspaper had to explain that, well, the law thinks you do, so for that reason we're telling you about it, you know. So we need to straighten that out, and that means political action. And that also means trying to get splinter groups together, forming a critical mass, which has always been a real challenge for deaf people, because there are so many different kinds of deaf people. But these are the issues that ethnic groups face all the time. I think we have a lot to learn from understanding American Indian experience better, and other ethnic groups.
Thank you very much.
Okay, time has run out for this portion of our program, but please do join us for the reception. And we will also have Dr. Lane's book on sale. And if you have a book with you, or if you buy a book, he will be willing to sign it for you. We'll do that until about 7. And then at 7, we'll have a follow-up discussion. We'll allow more questions and answers. So thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate your participation. And thank you, Dr. Lane.